I kept the matchbook from the Greyhound station for 50 years, because its crease remembered the way my hands trembled the night I closed a door I thought I could open again. I say this with my hands folded on my lap, the living room lamp making a soft coin of light on the crocheted doily I made when I was married. The house exhales the same way it always did in late October, a dry, porch sill wind that carries leaves like little apologies. The front steps still creak in the same rhythm as my father's boots used to, and sometimes, when the moon is thin and the train whistles far off like a whale song, I imagine I can hear the hollow in my chest resettle itself into that old cadence. I grew up where the road narrows and hedgerows press close to the asphalt, where farmhouse paint peels in obedient strips and porch lights blink like tired sentinels. My childhood was a patchwork of winter milk pails and summer berries sticky on my palms, of neighbors who borrowed sugar and returned casseroles, of a town where the news flew faster than the mail. I married at 23 beneath a maple that shed its leaves in theatrical swirls, because he promised me the kind of steadfastness that fits into everyday life, steady work, steady laughter, steady evenings with radio static and the smell of frying onions. We lived in a narrow house with floors that learned the pattern of our feet. There was a single hallway window where, in the evenings, light pooled like warm tea. I learned to read the seasons in the sound of that hallway, the hollow clack of boots in winter, the damp dull thud of summer storms. When the baby came, the house filled with a different kind of sound, small and urgent, the sound of a new insistence that rearranges the world. I held her like a secret and thought secrets and love were the same thing. My husband worked nights at the mill for a while, and later he took a job driving a delivery truck that smelled faintly of diesel and old newspapers. He was a man who measured his care in small repairs, a fixed roof line, a mended fence post, the way he learned the route that would avoid the worst potholes. He was not the kind to speak of deeper things. He showed me steadiness in how he made coffee without asking, how he always remembered which side of the road to pass the mailman. I mistook that quiet for permanence. The first hint of the fracture was not a confrontation, but an accumulation of small absences. A missed supper here, a late night there. I learned to count the time between his leaving and his coming home like marbles in a jar. The jars filled faster than I noticed. Once, I found his jacket in the back seat of a car I did not recognize. I ironed it and placed it back on the peg, as if iron could smooth whatever wrinkle lived under the fabric. I taped my own questions into small, polite corners of my sentences, and tucked them away so the house would not hear. There was a winter when the snow fell so cleanly the telephone poles looked like finials against the sky. The baby, my girl, who smelled of talcum and lemon soap, developed a fever that climbed in thin, stubborn stages. I wrapped her in blankets and listened to the thermometer click like a clock of bad news. My husband said he would be home early. He did not come. I remember the kitchen light bleeding onto the snow when I opened the door to look for tracks and found none but his. I waited until the moon shifted and the porch light burned low, until the creak of the steps matched the hollow in my throat. At some point that night I wrapped the baby in her soft green blanket and took the bus to the Greyhound station because it seemed smaller, less liable to break me, to hand her to a stranger than to place her into a life already threaded with a fault I could not name. The station smelled of coffee gone cold and cigarette ash and metal that remembered the hands of 1,000 travelers. I sat on the bench with my coat tight and my hands raw from the way I had kept them clenched. I waited for a bus or for an answer or for an instruction from God, Instead I found only the long quiet of people who cannot find language for what has happened to them. I left my daughter with a woman who said she'd take her to a home where they could keep her safe while I got things sorted. She had kind eyes and a list in her pocket. She smelled faintly of mothballs and peppermint. I kissed the baby's forehead once, the way one might press a stamp onto a letter, and I left the matchbook on the bench because the clerk had spoken into the phone and then shoved that tiny paper rectangle toward me with a shrug, as if small objects could stand in for explanations. The matchbook is browned now. It retains a scent of bus fuel and old coffee. Sometimes when I hold it, the paper whisper tells me what I already know, that I left because I believed leaving would fix something that had never been mine to mend. 4 years I made a life out of the parts that still fit together. I worked at the diner down on Main, running my hand along the counters until my palm memorized every nick. I watched other people's routines form and unravel. Their small dramas were predictable, like recipes. I learned how to smile at patrons who told me their troubles in syrupy, hopeful fragments. I kept my daughter's pictures in a showbox lined with tissue paper under my bed, and when the house was at its quietest, I would take them out and study the curve of her chin, as if I could chart salvation in the angles of a face. The truth is not the kind of thing you find in sudden confessions. It is a slow erosion. My husband left the year after I took her to the station. He said he loved me in a way that sounded like he was describing a map he could no longer read. He left me the empty rooms and a stack of bills and a voicemail that hummed with a silence I could not answer. I went to the social worker offices, and to the courtrooms, and to the little sliding windows that guard the welfare officers like sentries who have learned not to be surprised. I signed papers and made plans and learned how to stitch together a life with the raw edges showing. I taught myself the language of practical survival, when to call and when to wait, which forms to fill, how to soften the edges of bad news for strangers. I learned how to say no softly, and I'll try even softer. At night I would breathe the house in like someone taking inventory of a failing appliance. I checked the pipes and warmed the bed, and I studied the deepest hours for any sign of footsteps. There were men who knocked and left recipes. There were jobs that ended with good luck, and there were neighbors who never asked, but stood ready with casseroles for a holiday. The town was better at practical kindness than at asking what it would mean to carry a life burdened by a missing person. The secret I kept, the little thing that grew like a root under the soil of my days, is this: after the woman at the station left with my baby, I did not go home. I rode 2 buses and watched the town smear by in the window, and I thought I could shrink the wait by walking away, by pretending the leaving had been a temporary solution. I stayed in a boarding house by the river for 3 nights and listened to other people's arguments and small triumphs through thin walls. I ate cold stew and slept in my clothes. I prayed in a way that had the shape of bargaining. If I return and the pieces are intact, I will be careful, I will atone, I will learn to be smaller. If I return and find ruin, I will accept it and bear it. On the 4th day I went back to the station with my coin purse and my stomach in knots of regret. The woman with the mothball-scented coat was there, the list in her pocket, as if lists keep the world sensible. She looked at me with measured pity, and then with something like a guarded refusal. They had taken the baby to a foster home out of concern for her safety while I resolved my situation, she said. The word resolved had an antiseptic quality. It brushed the edges of what had happened and tried to make it manageable. I asked for her name. I asked where she was. The answers were slow and rehearsed. The foster system had its timetables and legalities. There were forms, and there were policies, and there were waiting lists like thin bones. They told me to come back with proof of stability. They told me to find a place to stay, to bring references, to learn how to be documented and predictable. In small, bureaucratic increments, I watched the possibility of taking her home become a conditional thing, dependent on papers and time, and that strange American currency called proof. I did what they asked. I worked and I gathered references, and I learned to make appointments and keep them. I scrubbed my history until it seemed to me I had polished it to a dull shine. Months turned into a year. The showbox under my bed became a small museum of hope that I visited with clean hands. By the time I was allowed supervised visits, the child in the photographs had become a child who looked at me with an expression that did not fit my memories. There was a distance in her eyes, an inherited caution that had been taught by waiting. She learned to be careful because the world around her had taught her that carelessness cost you the people you loved. When she kissed me on the cheek at the visitation center, it was polite and swift, like someone checking an item off a list. She had learned the vocabulary of survival better than I had ever taught her. Years passed in soft, clipped increments. I fought for custody and lost battles I did not understand until a judge used words the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precise and removing. They said stability, they said best interests, and I agreed on the outside while something in me folded inward. I live with the fact that legal determinations do not always map onto the heart's understanding of where a child belongs. I learned to respect the way the system keeps children safe and the way it sometimes closes its own doors. There is a memory I have not told anyone until this room, until this lamp, when my voice is as thin as the paper of the matchbook. The night I left at the station, a man watched me from across the room. He had the hard, quiet face of someone who had kept 1,000 small defeats. He rose and came to me and said nothing at first, then he said, "Sometimes leaving is a kindness." He did not offer to take my hand. He only folded his jacket and left it on the seat beside me like an unspoken suggestion. In my chest I felt a small opening, like a window cracked in a storm. I thought that perhaps if I left I would be merciful to the child and to myself. I thought that absence might soften whatever sharp edges were between us. That was the thinking of someone who had not yet learned that time shapes guilt into a stone. I spent decades stitching tenderness into the days that remained. I went to church when my knees worked and walked in the park when my breath allowed. I planted bulbs in the autumn and watched them push like promises in spring. I learned the edges of my grief and folded them into other people's needs, into volunteer shifts, and the careful tending of a neighbor's cat when they were gone. I built a life that could be described as respectable from the outside, full of appointments kept and small loans repaid. Inside, there was the ache of an absence that had become companionable in its constancy. Sometimes late at night I set the matchbook on the windowsill and watched the train go by like a slow, persistent thought. It is not forgiveness I keep hoping for. Forgiveness is a public thing, often traded between people in the light. What I harbor is the possibility that one day the sound of wheels on rail will fold into the sound of a child returning to a front step. I have learned the shape of waiting. It is not the same as hope, though it borrows from it. I will not pretend my choices were innocent. I will not dress them in saintly garments. I left because I was afraid that my fear would teach my child how to be afraid. I left because I thought absence could be an answer. It was both an attempt at mercy and a selfish concealment. The truth sits in me like a polished stone, smooth, heavy, honest. When I think of her now, I picture her on an autumn porch with a mug warm in her hands, the kettle singing like a small animal, and I imagine she is okay in ways I can accept and in ways I cannot. I wonder if she ever smells talcum and thinks of me, or if my name is a soft fact she keeps folded with photographs. There is no ceremony large enough for this regret, no altar to lay it out upon. There is only the small room, the lamp, the doily, and my hand over the matchbook. I keep breathing, the wind keeps living its quiet business. When the train passes and the whisper of its wheels moves across the night, I count the seconds between its sound and the settling of my chest, as if time itself might give me back a moment. I keep watch in the way an old woman watches for the weather, with a practical tenderness, a slow inventory of what remains. I will say one last small thing before the lamp grows crooked with the sleep of the house. I am not a monument to my mistakes. I am a woman who made them and then learned a different kind of keeping. If there is a mercy left, let it be that my story is remembered not only for the leaving, but for every small, careful attempt I made to make amends after the fact. I have carried my own absence so long it has become my shadow, and tonight I try, for the first time, to carry it gently.